Jason stared at his brown paper bag, his lunch tucked carefully inside. He was a creature of habit, and he liked the routine of it all. Every morning, he'd wake up early, grab his lunch from the kitchen, and slip it into his backpack before heading to school. It wasn't much, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a juice box. Nothing fancy, but it was his. Today, like every other day, Jason sat at his desk in Mr. Carson's fifth-grade class, his lunch bag resting quietly on the corner of the desk, out of sight from anyone except himself. The sound of students chatting and the occasional laughter filled the air. He glanced around the room, trying not to draw attention to himself. He wasn't one for the spotlight. The shy kid. The one who always kept to himself. The kid who sat in the back corner and barely made a sound. But that wasn't what bothered him today. What bothered him today was that he had to watch it happen again. Ms. Lawrence, his teacher, had walked into the classroom a few minutes ago. She was a tall woman, always busy with a clipboard or a pile of papers. Her eyes were always scanning, never quite looking at the students. She was the kind of teacher who never seemed to stop moving, always focused on the next task at hand. Jason had gotten used to her, but there was something about her that didn't sit right with him. Every day, without fail, Ms. Lawrence would come into the classroom, walk over to his desk, and grab his lunch. She wouldn't ask. She wouldn't smile. She would just take it, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. At first, Jason thought it was a mistake. Maybe she was just distracted, or maybe she had confused his lunch with someone else's. But no. It happened every single day. She'd come in, stand next to his desk, and take his lunch. Jason didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to react. It wasn't like he could ask for it back. Not in front of everyone. Not in front of the other students who were already whispering behind his back. It wasn't that he didn't want to stand up for himself, he just didn't know how. And so, day after day, he watched as Ms. Lawrence took his lunch, without a word, without a second glance. She'd walk back to her desk, unwrap the sandwich, and take a bite, as if it was nothing more than a routine. Jason kept his eyes down, pretending not to notice. He didn't want anyone to see the hurt in his face. He didn't want anyone to know how much it stung each time it happened. Today was different, though. Today, as Ms. Lawrence approached his desk, Jason couldn't just let it happen again. He had to do something. But what? He couldn't stop her. He couldn't stand up to her. She was his teacher. He was just a kid. What could he possibly do to change things? He sat there, frozen, staring at his lunch bag, feeling a knot twist in his stomach. Was there a way to make it stop? He wasn't sure. Ms. Lawrence reached for his lunch, her hand hovering over the brown paper bag. Jason's heart raced, and for the briefest moment, he thought about speaking up. Maybe he could ask her, just ask her to stop. Maybe she didn't even realize what she was doing. But no words came out. The knot in his stomach grew tighter. The words were trapped inside his throat, unwilling to escape. He couldn't do it. He couldn't speak up. So he watched, helpless, as she grabbed the bag and walked away. That was it. Another day. Another lunch stolen. Jason tried to focus on the lesson, tried to push the feeling of emptiness that spread through him, but it was hard. His stomach growled quietly, a reminder of what he had just lost. He wanted to cry, but he didn't. He wouldn't. He couldn't. His mind raced with questions. Why did she do this? Why him? Why not anyone else? It wasn't like he had ever done anything to deserve it. He wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't ask for attention. He just wanted to get through the day, go home, and forget about school for a while. But now, it was becoming impossible to ignore. Jason sighed quietly, hoping that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be different. Maybe she wouldn't take his lunch again. Maybe things would change. But deep down, he knew better. He knew it would happen again tomorrow, just like it had happened every day before. It wasn't just his lunch she was taking, it was his peace of mind, his sense of safety. It was something he didn't know how to get back. As the bell rang and the students filed out of the classroom for lunch, Jason lingered behind, pretending to clean his desk. He couldn't face his classmates just yet. Not with the feeling of humiliation still fresh in his chest. "Jason, are you coming?" his best friend, Mark, called from the door. Jason smiled weakly and nodded, quickly shoving his things into his backpack. He couldn't let Mark see how upset he was. No one could. He was used to hiding his emotions. It was easier that way. But as he walked out of the classroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He didn't know what, but he knew that this wouldn't last forever. One way or another, something was going to happen. He couldn't keep letting this go on. He just didn't know yet what that something would be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jason sat quietly at his desk, watching the other students race out of the classroom for lunch. He didn't feel like eating anyway, not after what had just happened. His stomach growled, but it wasn't just hunger, it was something deeper, a hollow feeling that had begun to settle in his chest. He stared at the empty desk in front of him, trying to ignore the tears that threatened to spill from his eyes. He wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of anyone. Mark was already at the door, waiting for him. "Come on, man, you're gonna be late," he called. Jason managed a faint smile and quickly grabbed his things, shoving them into his backpack as he made his way out the door. But as he walked down the hall, his mind kept drifting back to the same thing, Ms. Lawrence. She had been his teacher for almost 2 years now, and he knew her better than most students did. But that didn't mean he understood her. Not really. Ms. Lawrence was always so busy, always rushing around, always scribbling on her clipboard or buried in a pile of papers. To everyone else, she was just the teacher who never smiled much, the one who gave out homework like it was her job to pile stress on their shoulders. And she never seemed to notice when students struggled. At least, that's how it seemed to Jason. He'd always been quiet, always kept his head down, trying to avoid drawing attention. But that didn't mean he didn't notice things. Ms. Lawrence had been different from the other teachers. She didn't have that warm, welcoming vibe that made students feel comfortable. She wasn't like Mr. Carson, whose jokes made everyone laugh, or Ms. Thompson, who always had a way of making students feel special. No, Ms. Lawrence was distant. Cold, even. And yet, there was something about her that intrigued Jason. Something that made him wonder what she was really like when she wasn't stuck behind that desk, buried in paperwork. He sometimes imagined what it would be like to have a real conversation with her, to understand why she acted the way she did. But it was hard. He never had the courage to talk to her. Not like he could with the other teachers. His mind wandered back to the day's events. Jason couldn't help but think about why she took his lunch every single day. At first, he thought it was just an oversight, but no, it had happened too many times now. It was almost like a routine for her, and he had become part of that routine, whether he wanted to be or not. What hurt the most wasn't the lunch itself, it was the feeling of being invisible. She never asked, never said a word. It was like he didn't matter to her, like he was just some background noise she didn't even notice. Jason hated feeling invisible. He wasn't the kid who stood out in class, sure. He wasn't the one raising his hand every few seconds or telling funny jokes. But he still existed. He still mattered. Didn't he? As Jason wandered the schoolyard with Mark, he kept his eyes on the ground, lost in thought. His friend chatted about the game they'd play after lunch, but Jason barely listened. He wasn't sure he even cared about the game. It wasn't the distraction he needed. Jason found a spot by the swings and sat down, pulling his backpack onto his lap. Mark went off to join the others, but Jason stayed behind. He wanted to be alone for a little while, to sort through the jumble of emotions swirling inside him. He'd been trying to ignore them, to push them down, but it wasn't working anymore. And then, out of nowhere, Jason felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around, startled, and saw a familiar face, Ms. Lawrence. "Jason," she said, her voice softer than usual, though still distant. "I just wanted to check in. Are you okay?" Jason blinked in surprise. Was this real? Was she actually talking to him? After all this time? "I'm fine," he mumbled, not looking her in the eye. She nodded, looking uncomfortable. "I know I've been a little distracted lately. There's been a lot going on. But I want you to know that if you ever need anything, you can talk to me." Jason stared at her, unsure what to say. Was this an apology? It didn't feel like one. It just felt strange. "I don't need anything," he replied quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Lawrence stood there for a moment, looking at him with a slight frown. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and walked away. Jason was left sitting there, still holding his lunch bag. His stomach ached, not just from hunger, but from the confusion he felt. Was that the beginning of something? Or was it just another empty gesture? Jason didn't know. But he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. Jason couldn't stop thinking about the brief encounter with Ms. Lawrence. He wasn't sure what had happened, or why it had happened. Was she trying to be nice? Was she just feeling guilty about taking his lunch every day? Or was she just going through the motions, doing what she thought was expected of her? The more Jason thought about it, the more confused he became. Back in class, Jason couldn't focus. The lesson on fractions seemed to drag on forever, but his mind kept drifting back to Ms. Lawrence. Why had she approached him? It was unlike her. Ms. Lawrence didn't usually pay attention to the students outside of her duties. She wasn't the teacher who would go out of her way to check in on anyone, especially not a quiet student like him. "Jason, can you answer number 3? Mr. Carson's voice cut through Jason's thoughts, and he looked up, startled. Everyone in the room was staring at him. Sorry, can you repeat the question?" Jason stammered, feeling his face turn red. Mr. Carson smiled good-naturedly. "We're talking about fractions, Jason. Can you tell me what 3/4 of 12 is?" Jason quickly did the math in his head. 9, he answered, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. "Correct," Mr. Carson said, but his tone had changed. Jason could feel the other students watching him. It wasn't the usual teasing, but it was still uncomfortable. He quickly went back to looking down at his desk, not wanting to meet anyone's eyes. His thoughts were still racing. Why was Ms. Lawrence being nice all of a sudden? Jason couldn't help but feel like there was more to the situation than just the stolen lunches. Something wasn't adding up. As soon as the bell rang and the students scrambled to pack up for their next class, Jason packed his things slowly. He needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. Mark waved to him, already heading out the door with the rest of the class, but Jason hung back for a moment. When the room cleared out, he stood up and walked towards the teacher's desk. Ms. Lawrence was still sitting at her desk, flipping through papers as she usually did. But today, there was something different in the way she held herself. The usual tension in her shoulders seemed a little less rigid, her eyes a little less focused on the task in front of her. Jason took a deep breath and approached her. "Ms. Lawrence," he said softly, unsure if he was doing the right thing. She looked up at him, a little surprised. "Yes, Jason. Can we talk?" His heart raced in his chest. This wasn't like him. Normally, he would have kept quiet, pretended nothing was wrong. But today, he couldn't. He just couldn't ignore it anymore. Ms. Lawrence hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, Jason. What's on your mind?" Jason shifted nervously on his feet. He wasn't sure how to begin, but somehow the words came out. "I don't know why you take my lunch every day," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It doesn't feel right. It's like I don't matter." Ms. Lawrence's expression softened, and she set her papers aside. She studied him for a long moment, as if she were trying to read him, to understand him better. "Jason. I'm sorry if I've hurt you," she said, her voice unexpectedly gentle. "I never meant for you to feel like you don't matter." Jason looked at her, confused. "Then why do you do it? Every day, you just take it without saying anything." Ms. Lawrence seemed to consider his words carefully. "You're right," she said slowly. "I've been so caught up with everything else in my life that I haven't been paying attention to the students. I've been taking your lunch without even thinking about how it might make you feel. I never wanted to make you feel invisible or like you don't matter." Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time, it seemed like she truly understood what he was saying. She wasn't just brushing it off or telling him he was overreacting. She was really listening. "I didn't know how to fix it," Ms. Lawrence continued, her voice quieter now. "I've had a lot on my plate lately, and I guess I wasn't being the kind of teacher I should be. But I promise you, Jason, it won't happen again." Jason felt a knot in his chest begin to loosen. He wasn't sure if he fully believed her, but for the first time, he felt like there might be hope for a change. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling a little more at ease. "I just didn't know what to do. I didn't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing trouble, Jason," Ms. Lawrence said kindly. "I should have been more aware. But now that you've spoken up, I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Jason nodded, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't felt in weeks. The tension he had been carrying around, the unease he had felt every day about his lunch being taken, was starting to fade. Maybe things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. Maybe people could change. As Jason turned to leave the classroom, he looked back at Ms. Lawrence one last time. She was sitting there, her expression more thoughtful than he had ever seen. For a moment it was like he could see the person behind the teacher, someone who wasn't perfect, someone who made mistakes. But someone who was willing to learn from them. Jason stepped out into the hallway and felt a slight smile tug at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might actually have a voice in this world. The next few days at school felt different. Jason wasn't sure if it was the weight lifting off his shoulders, or if Ms. Lawrence's unexpected apology had sparked something within him, but the atmosphere seemed lighter. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he could breathe. It was as if the invisible wall that had surrounded him was finally beginning to crack, allowing him to step into the world around him. Every morning, when he grabbed his lunch, there was a small hope that things would be better, that maybe this time, Ms. Lawrence would do as she said and leave his lunch alone. And for the most part, she did. She hadn't taken his lunch since their conversation. Jason felt a sense of relief every time he saw her walk into the classroom without reaching for his lunch bag. He was no longer invisible. But that wasn't to say that things were perfect. Every time Ms. Lawrence passed by his desk, Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of her eyes on him. She didn't look at him like she used to, distracted, indifferent, but now there was something else. Something more. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the tension was palpable, like she was trying too hard to make up for the past. During class, she would occasionally catch his eye and offer him a small, awkward smile. Jason never knew how to respond. It wasn't like the smiles he'd seen from other teachers, warm and easy, but more like an apology, one that said, "I messed up, but I'm trying to make it right." He would force a small smile back, but deep down, he was still unsure of her. She had stolen his lunch every day for weeks. How could he just forget that? And then there was the lunchroom. It wasn't the same as before. Not because of the absence of Ms. Lawrence taking his lunch, no, that was just one part of it. It was the way the other kids looked at him now. For a few days after their conversation, no one seemed to notice or care. Jason ate his lunch in the corner, just like always, his brown paper bag with its simple sandwich and apple. No one made fun of him, no one stared, and no one asked why his lunch was always the same. For a while, it felt like peace. But then, as always happens in middle school, rumors started to spread. At first, Jason didn't think anything of it. He was used to whispers behind his back, the kind that kids do when they think they know something. He didn't really care. But the whispers were getting louder. It wasn't long before he started hearing things that made his heart race, things that made his stomach twist. "She's been taking his lunch every day. Have you noticed?" "Yeah, I heard she just grabs it without even asking." "What's up with that?" Jason froze mid-bite one day as he overheard two girls at the table behind him whispering about him. The conversation was about Ms. Lawrence. About him. Jason felt his face flush with embarrassment. His first instinct was to shrink into himself, to hide his face and pretend he hadn't heard anything. But it wasn't just about the lunches anymore. It was about the way they were talking about him. For the first time, he felt exposed. Like a part of him that had always been hidden was suddenly in the spotlight. The shame he had worked so hard to bury was rising again, stronger this time. As the days passed, the whispers grew. It was like they were everywhere now, huddled conversations in the hallways, at lunch, even during recess. Jason couldn't escape it. His lunch, his teacher, everything felt like it had become the subject of gossip. His friends, the ones who had always sat with him during lunch, started to act differently. Mark, who used to sit next to him without question, began to sit a few seats over. He wasn't outright ignoring Jason, but the distance was there. It was subtle at first, but Jason couldn't help but feel it. "Everything okay?" Mark asked one day, his voice tentative. Jason nodded quickly, even though everything inside him was screaming, "No, it's not okay." But he didn't want to talk about it. Not here, not in front of everyone. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile, but the words tasted bitter. He didn't feel fine. Mark gave him a doubtful look but said nothing more. That evening, as Jason sat at the dinner table, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was unraveling. The lunch rumors had become a part of his daily life now, and he couldn't escape them. He just wanted it to stop. But no one seemed to understand. His parents were focused on their own issues, work, bills, life, and they never noticed the small changes in him. They never noticed the way he kept to himself more, the way he stopped talking about school altogether. And then, the unthinkable happened. The following morning, as Jason walked into class, he noticed a message on the whiteboard. It was from Ms. Lawrence, and it was addressed to the entire class. "Please make sure to respect one another and be mindful of your actions. We all deserve kindness and understanding." Jason's heart sank. He knew what this meant. He knew that she had heard the rumors. He knew that this message wasn't just some generic note. It was for him. He wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him was grateful that she was trying to fix things, to make it right. But another part of him felt embarrassed, exposed, like she was calling attention to something he had never wanted anyone to know. That day, Ms. Lawrence wasn't in the classroom. She had to leave for a meeting, leaving the substitute teacher in charge. But when Jason looked at the empty desk, he couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, this day would be different. That maybe everything would go back to normal. But it wasn't. It couldn't. And as he packed his bag at the end of the day, Jason realized something: things had changed. But not in the way he had hoped. They had changed in a way that made everything feel more complicated, more uncertain. He wasn't sure where things were going, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't the same kid he had been before. The lunch, the rumors, the conversations, it was all too much. But it wasn't the end. No, Jason could feel it. Something big was coming. And he was ready for it. The days following Ms. Lawrence's message on the board felt heavy. Jason couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in the air. Every time he walked into class, his eyes would instinctively search for her, as if he could find some clue, some sign that things would go back to normal. But it was never there. The class had become a bit more subdued. The usual chatter in the hallways seemed to be quieter, as if everyone was walking on eggshells, unsure of how to act. Even the students who usually joked and teased were more careful now, giving Jason a wide berth that wasn't there before. It was strange. The change wasn't just in Ms. Lawrence's behavior, it was in everyone's. Jason tried his best to ignore the whispers and sideways glances, but it wasn't easy. When he walked into the cafeteria, the noise seemed to fade into the background. All he could hear was the sound of his own footsteps, echoing in his ears. Mark was waiting for him at their usual table, but this time, Jason couldn't help but notice the hesitation in his friend's eyes. It wasn't the same casual greeting anymore. There was something uncertain. Mark gave him a forced smile as Jason sat down, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You okay?" Mark asked, his voice quiet, as if he was afraid someone might overhear. Jason paused. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he was okay. Part of him wanted to say he was fine, to brush it off and pretend everything was normal. But he couldn't anymore. It was all too much, the stares, the gossip, the feeling of being exposed. "I don't know, man," Jason finally said, shaking his head. "Everything's just weird. Everyone's talking about it." Mark looked down at his tray, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge. "I heard some stuff too. People are saying, well, people are talking about Ms. Lawrence taking your lunch. About why she's been doing it. And why you never said anything." Jason's heart sank. He should have known. It wasn't just the whispers behind his back. It had become the talk of the school. And now Mark, his friend, was caught in the middle of it. "I didn't want anyone to know," Jason admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted it to stop." Mark nodded, though his face was filled with guilt. "I get it, man. But I think you should talk to someone. I mean, this isn't something that can just go away. And I think Ms. Lawrence needs to explain herself." Jason knew Mark was right. He couldn't keep avoiding it. But the thought of confronting Ms. Lawrence, of facing the truth, made him feel sick to his stomach. It had been easier to let it slide when it was just something he could quietly carry. But now that everyone knew, now that it had become a thing, it was like the weight of it was too much to bear. Just as he was about to respond, the lunchroom doors opened, and Ms. Lawrence walked in, her eyes scanning the room before she quickly looked away. Jason could feel the tension between them, but she didn't seem to notice it. Or maybe, she was pretending not to. She made her way toward the front of the room, where the teacher's table was set up, and took a seat at the end. Jason's heart raced. For a moment, it felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. "She's not even going to address it," Jason muttered, staring at her from across the cafeteria. Mark followed his gaze, then looked back at Jason with an unreadable expression. "You should talk to her. Seriously, Jason. She's not going to just fix it on her own. And if you don't speak up, it might just keep happening." Jason clenched his fists beneath the table. Mark was right. He couldn't wait for Ms. Lawrence to make the first move anymore. He had to do something. If this was ever going to stop, it had to come from him. Later that afternoon, as the bell rang and students filed out of the classroom, Jason found himself standing at the door, hesitating. His heart pounded in his chest. He had never been good at confrontation, never been the type to stand up for himself. But this wasn't just about his lunch anymore. This was about respect. This was about the feeling of being seen, of not being ignored. Jason took a deep breath and walked down the hall toward the teacher's lounge, where he knew Ms. Lawrence would be. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but he knew he had to do it. It was the only way to end the cycle of confusion and tension. When he knocked on the door, Ms. Lawrence looked up from her desk, surprised to see him standing there. Her expression shifted, a brief flash of worry crossing her face. "Jason? What's going on?" she asked, her voice soft, but with a note of concern. Jason swallowed hard. This was it. He had to speak up now. "I need to talk to you about the lunches," he said, his voice steady, but his stomach was a mess of nerves. "I don't know why you've been taking my lunch every day, but it needs to stop." Ms. Lawrence blinked, clearly taken aback. Jason, I thought we talked about this." I apologized for. "No, it's not just that," Jason interrupted. "It's not just the lunch. It's the way you've been acting, like I don't matter. Like it doesn't matter that I don't want to be treated that way. I just want to know why it happened. I want to understand." For a moment, Ms. Lawrence didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she sighed, standing up from her desk. "You're right," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "I've been dealing with some things of my own, Jason. And I guess I didn't realize how my actions were affecting you. I never meant to make you feel like you didn't matter. I see now that I've made a mistake." Jason felt a strange relief wash over him, even though the conversation was far from over. She wasn't brushing him off. She wasn't pretending that everything was fine. She was admitting that she had done wrong. "I'm sorry," Ms. Lawrence continued. "I know that doesn't make up for what happened, but I'm going to do better. I'll make sure this never happens again." Jason nodded, his throat tight. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't fix everything, but it was a start. As he walked back to his locker, Jason felt a small sense of victory. It wasn't a huge change, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had control over something in his life. And that feeling, however fleeting, was enough to give him hope. Jason walked through the halls of the school with a strange sense of relief, his shoulders feeling a little lighter than they had in weeks. Ms. Lawrence had apologized, and he felt the weight of the words she had said sink in. She had admitted her mistake, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was invisible anymore. But, as he turned the corner toward his next class, he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. He couldn't just walk away from the situation as if everything were fixed. The apology was important, yes, but the rumors still swirled around him like a dark cloud. The truth had come out, but the aftermath was still unraveling, and Jason wasn't sure he was prepared for it. As he walked into his English class, he was met with a curious gaze from some of the students. It wasn't outright judgment, but there was something new in their eyes, a mixture of intrigue and uncertainty. Jason felt his heart beat faster. The gossip had spread, and now everyone was wondering what had really happened with Ms. Lawrence. He quickly made his way to his seat, trying to avoid looking at the students around him. He just wanted to make it through the day. But as he sat down, his best friend, Mark, slid into the seat beside him. "You talked to her, huh?" Mark asked, his voice a little too loud, but Jason appreciated the attempt to lighten the mood. Jason nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah. I told her I wasn't okay with how she was acting. She apologized. It felt better." Mark gave him a small smile. "Good. It's about time you spoke up." Jason hesitated before answering. "Yeah, but I'm not sure it's over. I mean, the rumors are everywhere. It's not just about the lunch anymore. It's about me now." Mark's smile faded as he glanced around the room. "Yeah, I've heard some things. People are talking, but I think most of them just don't understand what was going on. They're confused." Jason sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I don't want to be the center of attention. I just want to be left alone." I get that, Mark said. But people will talk. They always do. All you can do is be yourself and let the rumors die down. Trust me, they'll get bored of it. Jason nodded but wasn't convinced. He had always hated being the subject of gossip. Now, it felt like it was all anyone could talk about. As the bell rang and the class began, Jason did his best to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept wandering. Every time he caught a glance from another student, he wondered what they were thinking. Were they judging him? Were they wondering what happened between him and Ms. Lawrence? And then there was Ms. Lawrence herself. The next day, she acted differently again. She wasn't as distant as she had been before, but she wasn't completely back to normal either. She seemed more reserved, more cautious around him. Jason wasn't sure if it was guilt or if she was just unsure of how to act. Either way, it made things feel even more awkward. During lunch, Jason sat alone at his usual table, picking at his sandwich, his eyes scanning the room. The whispers were still there, but they weren't as loud as before. He didn't know if it was because people had lost interest, or if they were just trying to be more discreet. That's when he saw her. Ms. Lawrence was standing by the lunch line, talking to another teacher. She hadn't seen him yet, but Jason couldn't help but notice how the students around her glanced at him, then quickly looked away. Some of them seemed to whisper to each other, eyes flicking nervously between him and the teacher. Jason's stomach churned. The rumors were still there. They were just quieter now, like an undercurrent that ran beneath everything. Hey, Jason. He turned to see Mark standing beside him, his tray of food in hand. Mind if I sit? Jason shook his head, trying to push his unease aside. Go ahead. Mark sat down across from him, looking around the cafeteria. Have you heard what people are saying? Jason closed his eyes for a moment. Please don't tell me. I already know. Mark hesitated before responding. Well, it's not just about the lunch anymore. People are saying Ms. Lawrence has been acting weird, like she feels guilty. Some think she's trying to make up for what happened. Jason sighed, feeling the weight of it all pressed down on him. It's just one big mess. Mark gave him a sympathetic look. I get it, man. I'm just saying, people are talking, but no one really knows what's going on. It's just weird. Jason wanted to tell Mark that he didn't care what people thought. That he just wanted to be left alone. But the truth was, he did care. He cared more than he wanted to admit. After lunch, Jason returned to class, his mind still preoccupied with the rumors. When the bell rang, he made his way to his next class, which was science. As he walked into the room, he saw Ms. Lawrence standing by the door, greeting students as they entered. She smiled at everyone as they came in, but when her eyes landed on Jason, her smile faltered for just a second. Jason couldn't look away, and for a brief moment, he felt like the only two people in the room were the two of them. But then she quickly masked it with a neutral expression and moved on to the next student. Jason's heart pounded. The weight of her gaze lingered in the air, and he couldn't escape it. He felt like she was trying so hard to act like nothing was wrong, like everything was normal. But he knew better. It wasn't normal. Nothing was normal anymore. As the class began, Jason tried to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept drifting back to the lunch table, to the looks, to the whispers. He was caught in the middle of something he didn't understand, something that wasn't going to go away anytime soon. After class, Jason gathered his things, his hands shaking slightly as he shoved his books into his bag. Just before he walked out the door, Ms. Lawrence caught his eye again. This time, she didn't smile. She just gave him a small nod. And Jason? He nodded back, feeling more alone than ever. Jason barely managed to get through the rest of his day without feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily over him. Each class was an exercise in trying to maintain his composure, to keep his mind from spiraling. Every glance, every whispered conversation, felt like a reminder of the mess he was stuck in. He was more than just the quiet student now, he was a subject of curiosity, and worse, a part of a scandal that had spread like wildfire through the school. After school, he walked to his locker, hoping to get home quickly and forget about everything, even if it was just for a few hours. As he spun the combination dial, the sound of his phone vibrating in his pocket made him jump. He pulled it out, seeing that he had a new message from his dad. The text read, "Jason, we need to talk tonight. It's important." Jason frowned. He had just talked to his dad last week, and nothing had seemed off. The tone of the message felt different, almost urgent. He texted back quickly. "What's going on?" His dad's response was almost immediate. "I'll explain when you get home. It's about Ms. Lawrence." Jason's stomach dropped. The last thing he wanted was to talk about Ms. Lawrence with his dad. He had spent the entire day trying to figure out how to deal with the fallout from the lunch incident, and now his dad wanted to get involved too. Confused and a little anxious, Jason grabbed his bag from his locker and left the school, the strange message from his dad replaying in his mind. He couldn't even enjoy the walk home, knowing that something was coming, something big. When he finally got home, he dropped his bag in the hallway and walked into the kitchen, where his dad was sitting at the table, his face serious. "Dad?" Jason asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's going on?" His dad motioned for him to sit down. "Sit. I'm sure you've heard the rumors." Jason nodded, his heart sinking. He had hoped his dad wouldn't bring it up, but it seemed inevitable. "Yeah, I've heard. I don't really know how to deal with it." His dad's eyes softened for a moment, but there was an underlying tension in his posture. "I know, Jason. But there's something I need to tell you. It's about Ms. Lawrence." Jason's mind raced. Could it be possible that his dad knew something about Ms. Lawrence that he didn't? He didn't even know how to respond. Was he about to get an explanation for what had been happening, or was this going to make everything worse? His dad hesitated, then said, "I've been talking to a few people. A couple of parents reached out to me after they found out what was going on. They mentioned that Ms. Lawrence, she's been dealing with some things herself." Jason felt his brow furrow. "What kind of things?" "Well, apparently, she's been struggling with some personal issues," his dad continued. "I don't know all the details, but there were a few parents who got concerned about her behavior. They thought it was affecting her relationship with her students, particularly you." Jason's mind was spinning. Was this what it all came down to? Ms. Lawrence was going through something. That didn't excuse her actions, but it made it all the more complicated. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him. "Is that why she was taking my lunch?" Jason asked quietly, trying to make sense of it all. His dad nodded slowly. "That's what I'm gathering. But I also found out something else, something I didn't want to believe at first." Jason leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "There are some rumors that Ms. Lawrence is, well, she's being investigated. By the school, I mean. Apparently, someone raised a formal complaint. And now, they're looking into her actions more seriously." Jason's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was Ms. Lawrence being investigated? What did that mean for her? And what did it mean for him? "Does she know?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think she knows yet," his dad replied, his tone grim. "But things are escalating. The school can't just ignore it, Jason. There are too many people involved now. Too many people have seen what's been happening." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of the situation was hitting him harder now. It wasn't just about lunches anymore, it was about something much bigger. Ms. Lawrence's job, her future, it was all on the line. And he didn't know what he was supposed to do. "But what do I do?" Jason asked, his voice strained. "I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to make it worse for her." "I get it," Jason," his dad said gently. "But you have to be honest about what's been happening. If you don't speak up, it's going to keep hurting you, and it could hurt Ms. Lawrence in the long run too." Jason's mind raced. He hadn't wanted to be involved in this, to drag his emotions and his life into this mess. But it seemed like he didn't have a choice anymore. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he was at the center of it. Whether he liked it or not, his actions would determine the outcome. "I don't know if I can do that," Jason muttered, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can be the one to say what happened, to tell the truth." His dad placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know this isn't easy. But it's important. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you." Jason felt a tear slip down his cheek, one he couldn't hold back any longer. "I don't know what to think anymore, Dad." "I know," his dad said softly. "But whatever you choose to do, you have my support. Always." Jason sat there in silence, his heart heavy. The decision ahead of him was a painful one. But no matter what, it was one he had to make. Jason sat in his room that evening, the weight of his father's words still pressing down on him. The message had been clear, his silence could have consequences for both him and Ms. Lawrence. His mind was in turmoil, tangled in a web of confusion and guilt. The events of the past few weeks, Ms. Lawrence's behavior, the lunches, the rumors, had all blurred into one chaotic mess, and now he was supposed to somehow find clarity in the middle of it all. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages he had received from Mark and a few classmates, all asking if he was okay. But he couldn't bring himself to reply. The truth felt like an unspoken burden that he wasn't ready to face. How could he tell them what had really been going on? How could he explain the complexity of it all? Jason's eyes drifted to the corner of his room where a small box sat on his desk, a gift from his mom, a reminder of simpler times. She had given it to him for his birthday years ago, and it had been collecting dust ever since. It was a picture frame, a simple thing, but Jason's mom had told him that it would remind him to keep his head up, no matter how tough life got. He hadn't taken it seriously back then, but now, staring at it in the quiet of his room, it felt like an anchor in a storm. He stood up and walked over to the desk, picking up the box. He could almost hear her voice in his head. "Life won't always make sense, Jason. But you have to keep going, no matter what." Jason placed the box back down and sat on his bed, still deep in thought. What was he supposed to do? Should he tell the truth about Ms. Lawrence? Should he tell the school what had been happening, or should he just let it all fade away? There was so much riding on his decision, and he felt like he was standing at a crossroads without a clear path in sight. As the night wore on, he tossed and turned in bed, unable to escape the thoughts racing through his mind. He thought about Ms. Lawrence. He thought about how she had apologized, how she had admitted her mistakes. But he also thought about the bigger picture, the investigation, the parents who were involved, and how much of a mess it all seemed to be. He thought about his dad's words. Jason had never been one to shy away from responsibility, but this felt different. The pressure to make the right choice was suffocating, and yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. The following morning, Jason woke up to a text message from Mark. It was short and to the point. "Hey, heard some new stuff. You good? Wanna talk?" Jason stared at the message for a long time. Mark had been there for him, always offering support. But this was different. Mark couldn't understand the weight of the situation the way Jason did. This wasn't just about gossip anymore, it was about lives, careers, and decisions that could change everything. Jason's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Ms. Lawrence. It was unexpected, and he froze for a moment, not sure how to respond. The message was simple. "Jason, can we talk before school today? I need to explain some things." Jason hesitated. His first instinct was to ignore it, to keep his distance. But something inside him told him that ignoring this would only make everything worse. If he was going to move forward, he had to face what had happened. He had to confront the truth. After a few moments, he typed out a reply. "Sure. Where do you want to meet?" She responded almost immediately. "The courtyard. I'll be there before the bell rings." Jason took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what Ms. Lawrence was going to say, but it was clear that she wanted to clear the air. Maybe this conversation could finally provide some answers. When he arrived at school, Jason made his way to the courtyard, his stomach twisted in knots. As he approached, he saw Ms. Lawrence standing by the bench near the big oak tree. She was looking down at the ground, her arms crossed, a heavy sigh escaping her lips as she saw him approach. "Jason," she said softly. "I wasn't sure you'd show up." Jason stopped a few feet away from her, unsure of what to say. There was so much to unpack, so much he wanted to ask, but he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he just nodded. "I don't really know what to say either, Ms. Lawrence." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sincerity. "I know. And I understand if you don't want to talk about it. But I need to be honest with you, Jason. Everything that happened, it wasn't just about you." Jason frowned. "What do you mean?" Ms. Lawrence took a deep breath, as though gathering her thoughts. "I've been going through some personal issues. Things that I should have dealt with before they started affecting my students. But the truth is, I've been struggling, and I took it out on you. I never should have let my personal problems interfere with my job. And I'm sorry. I truly am." Jason's heart softened as he listened to her words. He had known something was off with Ms. Lawrence, but hearing her admit it, hearing her take responsibility, was something he hadn't expected. I didn't know," Jason said quietly. "I didn't know it was that bad. I tried to keep it hidden," she said, her voice trembling. "But it caught up with me. And I'm so sorry I dragged you into it." Jason stood there for a long moment, processing everything she had just said. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to scream at her for the things she had done. But in that moment, all he could feel was a deep sense of empathy. She was just as human as he was. She had made mistakes, and now, she was owning up to them. "I get it," Jason said at last. "But the truth is, this situation has gone way beyond just you and me. People are talking. And I don't know if I can just let that slide." Ms. Lawrence nodded, her face clouded with concern. "I understand. And I'm not asking you to stay quiet. But whatever happens next, I want you to know I am truly sorry for what I put you through." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. "I don't know what's going to happen, Ms. Lawrence. I really don't." She smiled weakly. "Neither do I. But whatever the outcome, just know that I appreciate you speaking up." As the bell rang, signaling the start of another school day, Jason realized something. The weight of silence had lifted a little, but the road ahead was still uncertain. He had made a choice, he would tell the truth. Now, all he could do was hope that the truth would set things right. Jason barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, thoughts of Ms. Lawrence, the investigation, and the relentless rumors seemed to swirl around him, blocking out any hope for peace. The conversation in the courtyard earlier that day had left him with more questions than answers. He was no longer just a student affected by Ms. Lawrence's strange behavior, he was a part of something bigger, something that could change the trajectory of both their lives. The next morning, Jason found himself sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his textbooks. His phone sat untouched beside him, a constant reminder that things were not normal anymore. He was used to being a quiet, invisible student, the kind who blended into the background. But now, he was at the center of it all, with his name whispered in every hallway and his life examined by people he barely knew. The school day began, but Jason barely registered the passing hours. He shuffled from class to class, answering questions when prompted, but his mind was elsewhere. It was the same for everyone else around him. People avoided eye contact, whispered behind his back, and shot him strange looks. No one had outright confronted him about the rumors, but it was clear they had all heard. By lunch, Jason had had enough. He grabbed his tray from the cafeteria line and walked toward the usual spot in the back of the room. As he passed by, a group of kids from his history class snickered, their laughter barely muffled by their hands. Jason felt the familiar sting of embarrassment, but this time it was sharper, more suffocating. He sat down, pushing his food around aimlessly, unable to bring himself to eat. Mark had sent him a message earlier, asking if they could meet after school. Jason had agreed, though he wasn't sure what he would even say to his best friend. Mark had always been there for him, but this situation was different. Jason didn't want to burden him with the mess he was living in. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his dad. "Jason, I need to talk to you. I know things are tough right now, but we need to figure out what comes next. Please call me when you can." Jason let out a frustrated sigh. His dad was involved now too. Every aspect of his life was being drawn into this storm. He didn't know how much more he could take. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jason barely registered the bell signaling the end of school. His mind was too heavy with the weight of his decisions. When the bell rang again, signaling the start of his meeting with Mark, Jason stood up slowly, gathering his things. He needed to talk to someone, even if that someone couldn't understand everything he was feeling. Mark was waiting for him by the front doors of the school, as usual. He was pacing back and forth, looking frustrated, but when he saw Jason, his expression softened. "Hey, man," Mark said, his voice gentle. "You okay?" Jason shook his head, unable to explain everything that had happened, or how he was feeling. Instead, he simply replied, "I don't know." Mark put a hand on his shoulder. "I know it's been rough. But I've been hearing things. People are saying that you're the reason Ms. Lawrence's stuff came out. That you were the one who told the school." Jason froze, the words hitting him like a punch. "What?" he said, his voice rising in disbelief. "No. I didn't tell anyone. I haven't said anything." Mark seemed to hesitate for a moment, then continued, "It's just that, the way people are talking about it, it's like everyone's pointing fingers at you. I know it's not fair, but it feels like you're in the middle of this whole mess." Jason's heart sank. This was exactly what he had feared. The rumors had already twisted into something else entirely. His friends, his classmates, even teachers, everyone was going to think he was the one who had exposed Ms. Lawrence, when the reality was far more complicated. "I didn't do it," Jason said quietly, his voice breaking. "I never told anyone. I don't know what happened. I don't know what to do anymore." Mark looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Jason, I believe you. But you have to realize, no one else might. People are going to talk. And when they do, they won't care about the details. They're just going to want answers. And they're going to want someone to blame." Jason felt his chest tighten. He knew Mark was right. He could already feel the pressure mounting, the weight of people's expectations pushing down on him. But what hurt the most was that it was happening without him even saying a word. "I can't keep this up," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. Everyone's looking at me like I'm the one who caused it all. I just want it to stop." Mark's face softened, and he took a step closer. "Look, I don't know what's going to happen next. But whatever happens, you're not alone in this. I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere." Jason felt a surge of gratitude for his friend, even though it wasn't enough to chase away the uncertainty that loomed over him. He still didn't know what the right thing to do was. But one thing was clear, the storm wasn't over yet. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could ride it out. After they parted ways, Jason went home, his head swirling with everything Mark had said. He had to make a decision, but the weight of it felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on his shoulders. As he walked through the front door, his dad was waiting for him in the living room, his expression serious. "Jason," his dad said, "we need to talk." Jason nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This conversation, whatever it was going to change everything. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Jason's stomach churned as he sat down on the couch, his eyes nervously flicking between his father's serious face and the floor. The weight of the conversation ahead of him felt suffocating. He didn't know what his dad wanted to talk about, but he already had a sinking feeling that it had something to do with the chaos surrounding Ms. Lawrence. "Dad, I don't know what you've heard, but I didn't," Jason started, but his father raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Jason, just listen to me," his father said softly. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable urgency behind it. "I know things have been difficult at school. And I know you're trying to figure this whole situation out. But I've been hearing some things, and I need to know what happened." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "What things?" His father hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's an investigation going on. About Ms. Lawrence. About you. About everything that's been happening." His voice trailed off as if he was trying to process the words before saying them. "Jason, people are talking, and I need to know the truth. What's really going on?" Jason felt his throat tighten. It was as if his dad's words had somehow made everything feel more real. The rumors, the whispers, the entire situation had now made its way to his family. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had never been good at articulating his emotions, and now, more than ever, he was at a loss for how to explain the mess he found himself in. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Jason whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I swear, I didn't tell anyone about her, about what was going on." His father's face softened with understanding. "I know you didn't. But you have to realize, this is bigger than just you. You're in a tough spot, son. People are assuming things. And I know it's not fair, but that's the way it is. The only thing that matters now is how we handle it moving forward." Jason took a shaky breath, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He had always thought that his parents were his safe place, his support system. But now, it felt as if his entire world was unraveling in front of him. "Dad, I don't know what to do," Jason admitted. His voice cracked. "I don't know what the right thing is. I don't know what's going to happen to Ms. Lawrence or to me. I just want it to stop." His father leaned forward, his gaze intense but filled with compassion. "I know, Jason. I know it's hard. But sometimes, you have to take control of the situation, even when it feels like it's out of your hands. You've got to do what's right, even if it's not the easiest thing." Jason looked up at his dad, searching for some kind of clarity, some sign that everything would be okay. But there was none. There was only uncertainty. His mind was still spinning with all the conflicting emotions. The desire to protect Ms. Lawrence, the pressure to clear his own name, the fear of what would happen if the truth came out, it was all too much. "Dad, what do you mean by do what's right?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. "You have to be honest," his father said firmly. "You have to speak up. Whatever you've been holding in, whatever truth you've been hiding, you need to share it. It's the only way forward." Jason's stomach twisted. He wanted to tell his dad the truth. He wanted to explain everything, the lunches, the confusion, the emotional toll it had all taken on him. But there was so much more to it. What if his dad didn't understand? What if telling the truth only made things worse? "I'm scared," Jason said quietly, barely above a whisper. "I don't want to make things worse. What if people think I'm just as bad as Ms. Lawrence? What if they think I'm part of all of this?" His father's eyes softened, and he reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. No one is going to think that. I know you, Jason. You're not responsible for what happened. But you're responsible for how you handle it from here on out. You have to choose how you're going to move forward. Jason nodded slowly, but the knot in his chest remained. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure if there was a right way to handle this. But his dad was right about one thing: he couldn't stay silent forever. The truth would come out, one way or another. And when it did, he had to be prepared to face it. Just as Jason was about to speak, his phone buzzed, interrupting the tense moment. He glanced at the screen, his heart racing when he saw who it was. It was Ms. Lawrence. Jason, I need to talk to you. Can we meet after school? I've made a decision, and I need you to hear it first. Jason's pulse quickened. He glanced at his dad, who gave him a nod of encouragement. You should go, his dad said. This is your chance to get some answers. Jason wasn't sure what Ms. Lawrence was going to say, but one thing was clear: this conversation would be pivotal. His world had already been turned upside down, and now, it seemed like he was on the verge of learning the next big piece of the puzzle. As he typed out a quick response to Ms. Lawrence, Jason's mind raced. What was she going to tell him? What had she decided? He didn't know what he expected, but deep down, he knew that the decisions made in the coming days would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jason paced around his room, staring at his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen, unsure whether to send a reply or wait. The message from Ms. Lawrence weighed heavily on his mind. She wanted to meet. She had made a decision. But what could she possibly mean? Had she reached a breaking point, just like him? He wasn't sure if he was ready to meet with her, but something inside told him he had no choice. If he wanted answers, if he wanted any sense of closure to the mess his life had become, this was his chance. With one final sigh, he typed a quick reply. I'll meet you after school. Where and when? As soon as he hit send, Jason felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. He glanced at the clock. School was over in an hour, and he still had no idea what he was walking into. His dad's words echoed in his mind: you have to be honest. Whatever you've been holding in, whatever truth you've been hiding, you need to share it. Jason wasn't sure he was ready to confront the full truth. He hadn't even fully come to terms with it himself. But his dad was right about one thing: staying silent wouldn't get him anywhere. He shoved his phone into his pocket and tried to distract himself with homework, though his mind kept drifting back to Ms. Lawrence. What decision could she possibly have made? Jason couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was going to change after today, something big. When the final bell rang, Jason gathered his things and headed to the parking lot, his heart thudding in his chest. His stomach churned as he scanned the sea of students, wondering if anyone had caught wind of his meeting with Ms. Lawrence. The rumors had already spread like wildfire, and now it felt like the entire school was watching him, waiting for something to happen. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Ms. Lawrence's reply. Meet me behind the gym at 4. I'll be waiting. Jason shoved the phone back into his pocket, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if it was excitement or fear he was feeling, but the mixture of emotions had him on edge. Behind the gym, of all places. It was secluded, away from the eyes of the students, which made sense, considering the secrecy surrounding their conversations. But it also felt oddly ominous. As he walked toward the gym, Jason's thoughts started to spiral. What if she was in trouble? What if this meeting only made things worse? What if she confessed to everything, throwing him under the bus in the process? Or worse, what if she decided to disappear entirely, leaving him to deal with the fallout alone? Jason couldn't shake the feeling that today's meeting would be the turning point. It would determine whether he continued down this twisted road or found a way to move on with his life. By the time he reached the back of the gym, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty field. He glanced around, his pulse quickening. There was no sign of Ms. Lawrence yet. Jason lingered by the fence, trying to steady his nerves. He checked his phone again, but there was no new message from her. The air was cool, and the silence felt heavy. Then, just as he was about to turn around and leave, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned quickly, and there she was, Ms. Lawrence. She looked different. Tired, even more worn than before. Her once bright demeanor had faded, and she seemed like a shadow of the woman he had known just a few weeks ago. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Jason," she said, her voice barely audible in the quiet of the evening. "Thank you for coming." Jason didn't know what to say. The tension between them was palpable. She had been his teacher, someone who had believed in him and pushed him to be better, but now everything had shifted. They were no longer just teacher and student. Now, they were two people caught up in something much bigger than either of them could control. "What's going on?" Jason finally asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. "Why did you ask to meet me here?" Ms. Lawrence's eyes softened. She glanced around nervously, as if making sure no one was watching. "I've made some decisions," she said quietly. "I've realized that I can't run from this anymore. I can't hide what's been going on. It's time for me to face the consequences." Jason frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Her expression grew serious. "Jason, I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted to put you in the middle of this mess. But I know now that I've made mistakes, and I've hurt people, including you." Jason swallowed hard. He had no idea what she was talking about. The last time they spoke, she had seemed so confident, so sure of herself. But now, she looked like a completely different person. "Ms. Lawrence, I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "What mistakes? What are you talking about?" Ms. Lawrence sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "I've been under investigation. And I know you've heard the rumors. The truth is, I didn't just take lunch from you. I took your kindness for granted. I used you to fill a void that wasn't your responsibility to fill. And now, I'm facing the consequences of that." Jason's mind raced. This was the truth. This was what had been happening all along. She wasn't just the teacher he had come to admire, she was a woman caught in a mess of her own making, and now she was asking him to understand. "I never wanted to make you feel uncomfortable," Ms. Lawrence continued. "I never wanted you to be caught in the middle of my issues. But the truth is, I relied on you too much, and I crossed boundaries that I should never have crossed. I'm sorry, Jason. I'm so sorry." Jason stood there, frozen. He had so many questions, so many emotions churning inside him. But all he could do was nod, too stunned to say anything. "I never told anyone," Jason whispered. "I swear. I didn't tell anyone about us, about what happened." Ms. Lawrence gave him a sad, understanding smile. "I know you didn't, Jason. But you're the only one who knows the whole story. And now I need to step back and face the truth about my actions. I'm resigning, Jason. I have to." Jason's chest tightened. This was it. The truth had come out. Ms. Lawrence was walking away from it all. And in some way, Jason realized, he was too. This chapter of his life was closing, but it left him with more questions than answers. And as much as he wanted to make sense of everything, part of him knew he never could. "Goodbye, Jason," she said softly, her eyes filled with regret. "Take care of yourself. I hope you find peace." As she turned to leave, Jason felt a strange emptiness settle over him. He wasn't sure if this was the end of something or the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. But one thing was clear, the truth had been spoken, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jason stood there, staring at the empty spot where Ms. Lawrence had just been. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, emotions, and disbelief. He had hoped for clarity, but all he had now was more uncertainty than ever before. As he turned and walked away from the back of the gym, his mind replayed her words again and again. She was resigning. She was stepping away from the life that had once seemed so certain. But what about him? What did it all mean for him? Was this the closure he had been waiting for, or was it just another twist in a story that seemed to have no end? He walked through the parking lot in a daze, his steps slow and heavy. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't check it right away. His mind needed a moment to process everything that had just happened. Ms. Lawrence was gone. She was walking away from her job, from her life as his teacher. But what did that mean for him? How would this decision affect him? Jason didn't know how long he'd been walking, but eventually, he ended up at a bench near the school's entrance. He sat down and pulled his phone from his pocket, glancing at the screen. There were several notifications, but one message stood out. It was from his dad. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. We need to talk more. Let's meet at home when you're done. I think it's time we figure out how we're going to deal with all of this." Jason sighed, a mix of dread and resignation creeping into his chest. His dad had been right. This wasn't just about Ms. Lawrence anymore, it was about him, his future, and the aftermath of everything that had happened. It was about the decisions he had to make, and the consequences they would bring. He sat there for a few more minutes, trying to collect his thoughts, but nothing seemed clear. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or to retreat. When he finally stood up, he found his feet taking him home without him even realizing it. His thoughts were so consumed with the mess that had become his life that the world around him seemed to fade into the background. By the time he arrived home, the sky had turned dark. The house felt empty, quiet, as though it too was waiting for something to happen. He walked through the front door and found his dad sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, the faint glow of a lamp casting long shadows on the walls. "Sit down, son," his dad said, his voice steady but serious. Jason did as he was told, taking a seat across from his dad. He felt the weight of the conversation looming, the air thick with unsaid words. He didn't know how to start. He didn't know what to say. "So, you met with her," his dad said, breaking the silence. "What happened?" Jason opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain everything that had just unfolded? Ms. Lawrence was resigning. She was stepping away from everything. But it wasn't just that, there was the emotional toll it had taken on him, the confusion he still felt about their relationship, and the weight of the truth that had finally been revealed. "She's leaving," Jason finally said, his voice hollow. "She's resigning. She told me she crossed lines. She admitted she used me, and now she's walking away from it all." His dad's expression softened, but there was still a seriousness in his eyes. "I'm sorry, son. I know this has been hard on you. But you're not the only one affected by all of this. Ms. Lawrence made her choices, and now there are consequences to those choices. But that doesn't mean you have to carry all the weight of it. You have to let go of what you can't control." Jason felt a surge of frustration. How can I let go of it? How can I just forget about everything that happened? I was a part of it, Dad. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this now. His dad leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. You don't need to have all the answers right now. But you need to stop blaming yourself. This wasn't your fault. It wasn't your responsibility to fix it. You've been through something incredibly difficult, Jason, and I know it's hard, but you have to let it go. Jason's heart felt heavy, the guilt and confusion still weighing on him. It was hard to accept what his dad was saying. It was hard to believe that he wasn't to blame in some way. How could he not be, when everything had been so tangled up? But what about her? Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. What about Ms. Lawrence? What happens to her now? His dad sighed, sitting back in his chair. That's something she'll have to face on her own. You've done what you can, Jason. Now it's time for you to focus on yourself. You can't keep carrying this weight for her. Jason nodded slowly, though the words didn't offer the relief he had hoped for. He wasn't sure how to walk away from the situation. How to move on from everything that had happened. He felt like he had been dragged into something he didn't fully understand, and now it felt like it was over, but the consequences still lingered. The conversation turned into more silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Jason knew his dad meant well, but it didn't change how deeply unsettled he felt. He couldn't just forget about Ms. Lawrence, and he wasn't sure he was ready to let go of all the emotions still swirling in his chest. But for now, his dad's advice hung in the air. He needed to stop blaming himself. The days after his conversation with his dad felt like walking through fog. Everything seemed muted, distant. Jason went through the motions of his daily routine, attending school, finishing assignments, trying to be present. But it all felt hollow, like he was on autopilot. The weight of everything that had happened, the secrets and the truths, still pressed down on him. At school, the usual whispers and sideways glances followed him wherever he went. Students who once seemed like friendly faces were now strangers. Some were sympathetic, some were curious, and some, Jason knew, were just waiting for something to happen. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew something he didn't. That the world had shifted around him, and he was just trying to keep up. The first few days after Ms. Lawrence's resignation were the hardest. His English class was noticeably different. Her absence left a hole in the classroom, a void that no one could fill. The substitute teacher, Mrs. Parker, was kind but distant, and the class felt like a shadow of what it had been before. Jason didn't mind the change, though. He didn't want to be reminded of everything that had happened. One afternoon, as he was leaving school, Jason's phone buzzed. It was a message from his best friend, Mark. "Hey, you good? We haven't talked in a while. Wanna hang out this weekend?" Jason hesitated for a moment. He hadn't really spoken to Mark much since everything had gone down. He'd pulled away from his friends, isolating himself in a way that didn't feel entirely intentional but happened all the same. But Mark was right, he hadn't reached out to anyone. "Yeah, sure. Maybe we can grab a bite or something. I'll text you later." Jason hit send and put the phone back in his pocket. The thought of hanging out with Mark felt strange, but maybe it was just what he needed. Maybe being around someone who wasn't involved in all the chaos could help him clear his head. Or at least distract him for a little while. That weekend, Jason and Mark met at their usual spot, a small cafe downtown where they had spent countless afternoons in the past, talking about everything from video games to their plans for the future. As they sat down, Jason felt the familiar comfort of Mark's easy smile and laid-back attitude. Mark wasn't judging him, he was just his friend. "So, how's everything been?" Mark asked, his voice casual but with a hint of concern behind it. "I know things have been weird, with everything going on." Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, it's been a lot. I don't even know where to begin, honestly." Mark nodded, understanding. "I get it. You've been dealing with a lot. But you don't have to go through it alone, man. I'm here for you, always." Jason gave him a small smile, grateful for his friend's support. He hadn't realized how much he needed it until now. "Thanks, Mark. I don't know if I've really processed everything that's happened, but, yeah. It's been tough." Mark leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his drink. "I get that. But you don't have to fix everything all at once. Take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this. You've got your family and your friends. And if you need to talk, I'm here. Jason nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. It wasn't that he hadn't heard this kind of support before, it was just that, for so long, he had kept his emotions bottled up. He hadn't let himself lean on anyone. Not since the whole thing with Ms. Lawrence had started. But hearing Mark's words, feeling the sincerity behind them, it was like a weight had been lifted, even if only a little bit. "Thanks, man," Jason said, his voice quiet. "It's just hard. I feel like I'm carrying a lot on my shoulders, and I don't know how to let go of it." Mark's eyes softened. "You don't have to let go of everything right now. But you can start by letting people in. Don't carry it all alone. You've got a lot of people who care about you, and they want to help." The conversation shifted after that, and they spent the next hour catching up, talking about school, their plans for the future, and random topics that used to fill their afternoons. It was the distraction Jason didn't know he needed. Being around Mark, laughing about nothing in particular, reminded him that he wasn't defined by the mistakes of others, or even by his own mistakes. He was just Jason. Later that evening, after saying goodbye to Mark, Jason felt a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't going to fix everything overnight. But maybe he didn't need to. Maybe what he needed most wasn't answers or closure, it was support. And that was something he wasn't going to find by shutting everyone out. He had to let people in, starting with Mark, and then his dad. Maybe he could finally let go of the guilt and confusion that had kept him in a state of limbo for so long. The next morning, Jason woke up with a different mindset. He was going to take his dad's advice. He would stop blaming himself for things that were out of his control. He would stop trying to carry the weight of everyone else's decisions on his shoulders. He had to focus on moving forward, even if it was just one step at a time. At school, Jason noticed a subtle shift. The whispers had faded, replaced by a sense of normalcy. There were still people who avoided eye contact with him, still students who whispered behind his back, but it didn't bother him as much. He had to keep reminding himself that he couldn't control how others viewed him, but he could control how he responded. After a particularly long day, Jason found himself back at the gym, staring up at the familiar building. It had been the site of so many memories, both good and bad. But for the first time in a long time, Jason didn't feel the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. He felt lighter. Maybe it was because he was finally letting go of the pressure he had been carrying for so long. With a deep breath, Jason turned and walked toward the parking lot, determined to keep moving forward. Jason's feet moved automatically, the path home familiar, yet his mind remained tangled in everything that had transpired. It had been weeks since Ms. Lawrence had left the school, weeks since he had begun to rebuild the fragile pieces of his life. But the threads of his past were still there, pulling him back every time he allowed himself to reflect. Every time his thoughts turned to her, to what had happened. He wished he could forget, wished he could move on without the weight of the past crushing him. But he couldn't. There were still unanswered questions. Still feelings he hadn't processed fully. Was what they had truly wrong? Was he just another casualty of a decision that neither of them could control? He sighed, the evening air cold against his skin as he walked down the sidewalk, trying to push the thoughts away. But it was no use. They came flooding back, like a tidal wave he couldn't outrun. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, expecting another message from Mark, maybe a meme or something light-hearted to distract him. But instead, it was from his dad. Jason had half expected to hear from him, especially after their talk last week. "We need to talk. Come home after school tomorrow. It's important." Jason stared at the message for a long moment, his heart rate picking up. There was no sign of anger or frustration in his dad's words, but something about the briefness of the message made his stomach churn. What could this be about? His mind raced, coming up with all sorts of scenarios. Was this about Ms. Lawrence? Was his dad going to confront him about things that had happened between them? His dad had been calm, steady, but he was always a man of few words. When he said something was important, it meant it was significant. Jason knew it wouldn't be just another casual conversation. The next day, Jason's nerves were on edge. It was one of those rare afternoons when he felt like everything was coming to a head. School was a blur, he wasn't paying attention, wasn't in the mood to deal with anything. All he could think about was the conversation awaiting him at home. When the final bell rang, he gathered his things and made his way to the car, his footsteps heavy on the concrete as his stomach churned with uncertainty. The drive home felt endless, even though it was only a few minutes. His mind replayed the last few days, his brief moments of normalcy with Mark, his dad's advice, the sense of distance he had felt from his classmates. He had tried to act like everything was fine, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. He pulled into the driveway, the same driveway he had parked in countless times before, but today it felt different. He was walking into something he didn't fully understand. Jason took a deep breath as he grabbed his bag and stepped out of the car, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing in the quiet neighborhood. Inside, his dad was sitting at the kitchen table, the same spot where they had talked a few days earlier. This time, his dad's expression was more serious, more focused. There were no distractions, just the two of them and whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Sit down, son," his dad said again, his voice calm but with an edge that made Jason's heart race. Jason didn't hesitate this time. He walked to the table and sat across from his dad, the weight of the situation pressing in on him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick with anticipation. Finally, his dad spoke. "I know you've been struggling with everything that happened with Ms. Lawrence," his dad began, his voice steady. "And I want you to know that I've been doing some thinking, too. I've been thinking about what you've gone through, what it's done to you, and how you've handled it." Jason's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if he even wanted to hear what his dad had to say. But he nodded, letting his dad continue. "Jason," his dad continued, "you've carried this burden on your own for too long. I've watched you try to shoulder it, and I can see it's wearing you down. But I want you to understand something, this situation, what happened, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't something you could have prevented." Jason's eyes fell to the table, his mind racing. The weight of his dad's words felt heavy, yet somehow relieving. It was like a small part of him had finally been validated. For so long, he had blamed himself, believing that somehow, if he had acted differently, everything could have been avoided. But hearing his dad say it aloud, that it wasn't his fault, brought a sense of clarity he had desperately needed. His dad paused for a moment, as if deciding how to continue. "I've made some calls, Jason," he said quietly. "I spoke with some people, professionals, actually. We need to take some next steps, not just for your sake, but for the sake of moving forward." Jason felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What kind of steps?" "I think it's time for you to talk to someone," his dad said, his eyes softening. "A counselor. Someone who can help you process everything that's happened. I know you've been holding it all inside, but it's not healthy. And I want you to know that it's okay to get help. It doesn't mean you're weak, or that you can't handle it. It just means you're ready to take the next step in healing." Jason sat back in his chair, the reality of his dad's words settling over him like a cold wave. He had never considered therapy or counseling as a real option. It had always seemed like something other people needed, not him. But now, hearing his dad's sincere concern, he began to wonder if maybe it was the right time. Maybe he did need help. "I'll think about it," Jason said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "That's all I'm asking," his dad replied. "Just think about it. And remember, you don't have to go through this alone. We'll get through it, together." Jason nodded, but his mind was already racing with the possibilities. This wasn't the easy solution he had hoped for. It wasn't as simple as just moving on. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he couldn't just ignore what had happened. He had to confront it, head-on, with help. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like maybe, just maybe, he was on the right path. The days following his conversation with his dad were a blur. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that his life was somehow changing in ways he hadn't expected or prepared for. The idea of talking to someone, of confronting everything he had kept buried for so long, made him feel exposed. Vulnerable. He had always been the kind of person who kept his emotions locked away, dealt with things on his own, and never sought help. It had been easier that way. But now, his dad's words echoed in his mind, "It's okay to get help." Jason didn't want to admit it, but part of him knew his dad was right. He couldn't keep going like this, trying to piece together a version of himself that had been shattered by his own doubts and the actions of others. Maybe, just maybe, he could allow himself to heal. The next week, after a lot of internal debating, Jason agreed to meet with the counselor his dad had arranged for him. Her name was Dr. Ellen Matthews, and she was a professional in dealing with trauma, especially the kind that lingered under the surface for a long time. He had no idea what to expect, but his dad had been insistent, reminding him that the first step was always the hardest. He had spent most of the week thinking about it. He had told Mark he would be seeing a counselor, and his friend had been supportive, but Jason could still feel the resistance inside him. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say, or if he even had the right to be there. After all, what had really happened to him? What had he lost? The counselor's office was located in a small building just a few blocks from his house. When he arrived, Jason sat in the waiting room for what felt like an eternity. His hands were sweaty, his mind racing. He looked around at the peaceful, neutral decor, the soft beige walls, the calming pictures of nature, and wondered if he'd made a mistake. What was the point of talking to someone about all this? How could he possibly explain something so complicated, so raw? When Dr. Matthews called his name, he stood up quickly, following her into a cozy, inviting room with comfortable chairs and a large window that let in soft afternoon light. It smelled faintly of lavender, a scent Jason found surprisingly comforting. Dr. Matthews had a warm smile and an aura of calm that seemed to settle his nerves a little. "Hi, Jason," she greeted him. "It's nice to meet you. Please, have a seat." Jason sat down on the chair she pointed to, feeling oddly exposed. He didn't know where to start. "I know this might feel a little strange at first," Dr. Matthews said, sitting across from him. "But I want you to know that this is a safe space. You can talk about whatever is on your mind. There's no rush, and there's no right or wrong way to do this. We're just going to take things one step at a time." Jason nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't know if he believed her, how could he, but he wasn't about to argue. Instead, he focused on her calm, inviting demeanor, hoping it would somehow make it easier. "So," Dr. Matthews continued, "I understand you've been going through some difficult things lately. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what's been weighing on you?" Jason shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on his jeans. His mind raced, but no words came out. He felt the pressure to say something meaningful, something important, but it was like his mouth had gone dry. How did he explain what he had been through? "Well," Jason started, the words feeling strange as they left his mouth, "there was this teacher. Ms. Lawrence. She was, a big part of my life for a while. And now, well, things are complicated. I feel like everyone's looking at me differently, like I'm guilty of something I didn't even do." Dr. Matthews nodded, her gaze steady in understanding. "That sounds really hard, Jason. It sounds like you've been carrying a lot of weight on your own." Jason's throat tightened, the emotions he had been bottling up for so long threatening to spill over. "I didn't want it to happen. I didn't want to be part of whatever it is people think happened. But I can't make them understand that. I can't make them see the truth. Sometimes," Dr. Matthews said gently, the truth isn't as clear to others as it is to us. But that doesn't mean you should carry the burden of their judgment. It's not your responsibility to make them understand. Your responsibility is to yourself. Jason blinked, surprised by the clarity of her words. It was like she had just given voice to a thought he had buried deep down. He wasn't responsible for anyone else's opinions of him. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. I've been trying to hold it all together, Jason admitted, the weight of his own words sinking in. I thought if I just ignored it, if I just kept pretending everything was fine, maybe I could move past it. But I can't. It's still there, eating at me. And it's like everyone expects me to just move on, but I don't even know how. Dr. Matthews leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. It's okay not to have all the answers right away, Jason. Healing takes time, and it's a journey. It's not something you can rush. But you've already taken an important step just by being here. You're acknowledging what's happened, and that's huge. Jason felt something inside him loosen. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe he didn't have to have it all figured out today, or even tomorrow. Maybe he just had to take it one day at a time and allow himself the grace to heal. The session lasted for nearly an hour, but Jason left feeling strangely lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his chest. He wasn't fixed, not by any means, but he had begun the process. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer felt so afraid of it. With the support of his dad, Mark, and now Dr. Matthews, Jason realized he wasn't alone on this journey. When he got home that evening, he walked into the kitchen where his dad was sitting, reading the paper. The usual tension in his chest had lessened, and he felt more at ease. So, how did it go? His dad asked, glancing up. Jason smiled, the first real smile in days. It was good. It felt like maybe I can actually start figuring things out. His dad gave a small nod, his expression soft. I'm proud of you, Jason. Jason didn't have the words to express everything he was feeling, but he didn't need to. His dad's approval, his support, meant more than anything right now. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, a new chapter in his life, one where he could finally start healing and moving forward. Jason awoke the next morning with a sense of quiet optimism he hadn't felt in weeks. The weight on his shoulders, while not entirely gone, felt a little less heavy. The night before, his mind had been buzzing with thoughts about his session with Dr. Matthews, about how he had shared things he'd kept locked up for so long. It hadn't been easy, but there had been something therapeutic about putting his feelings into words, even if he still wasn't sure what to do with them. The morning sun streamed through his window, casting a warm glow across his room. It was strange, he could feel the shift in himself, as if a small part of him had already started to heal. It wasn't a dramatic change, but there was something different in the way he woke up today, something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. He sat up, stretching his arms above his head and looking around at his familiar surroundings. Things hadn't changed, but he had. That was the first step, he realized. And the realization gave him a sense of purpose. He stood up and got dressed quickly, his mind already shifting to what the day would bring. It was a Wednesday, and there was still a week left of school before the summer break. The thought of having a break from everything, from the tension, the whispers, and the stares, was appealing. But there was still work to be done. He couldn't just ignore everything that had happened, he had to confront it, and part of that meant continuing his journey toward understanding and healing. As Jason walked into the kitchen for breakfast, his dad was already there, sipping a cup of coffee. It was the same routine, the same quiet moments they shared before the chaos of the day began. But today felt different. There was a calmness between them, a silent understanding that wasn't there before. "Morning, Dad," Jason said as he grabbed a granola bar. "Morning, son," his dad replied, looking up from the newspaper. "How'd you sleep?" "Better," Jason said with a small smile. "It was quieter in my head." His dad's eyes softened. "Good. I'm glad to hear that. Remember, you don't have to do everything all at once. One step at a time. Jason nodded, taking a bite of his granola bar. His dad's words, simple as they were, gave him a sense of peace. He didn't have to rush. Healing wasn't something that could be forced, it was a process. A slow, sometimes painful process. But it was still progress. When Jason got to school, things felt manageable. The usual tension was still there, the knowing glances and the quiet murmurs in the hallways. But somehow, he felt more equipped to deal with it. He wasn't the same person he was a few weeks ago. He had taken that first step toward understanding himself better. And for the first time in a long while, he was starting to feel like maybe he could take the next one. During lunch, Jason found himself sitting with Mark at their usual table. His friend was chatting away about something that had happened in class, but Jason wasn't fully listening. He was thinking about something else, something he hadn't fully considered until now, forgiveness. It had been a concept that had haunted him ever since everything had gone down with Ms. Lawrence. He had never considered that part of moving forward might involve forgiving, not just others, but himself too. He had been so focused on what he had lost, what had been taken from him, that he hadn't really allowed himself to let go of the anger or confusion he'd been holding on to. Jason realized now that it wasn't just about finding closure or figuring out what happened. It was about letting go of the weight of his own guilt and regret. If he wanted to truly move on, he would need to forgive himself for what he had let happen and for what he thought he should have done differently. Mark's voice pulled him back to the present. "Dude, you're really quiet today. You okay?" Jason gave him a small smile. "Yeah, just thinking about some stuff. Trying to figure things out." Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. He had been a solid friend through all of this, and Jason was thankful for him. "I know you're going through a lot right now," Mark said quietly. "But just remember, you don't have to do this alone." Jason appreciated the sentiment more than he could say. Sometimes, it was easy to forget that there were people around him who cared. His dad, Mark, even Dr. Matthews. They all wanted to see him succeed, to see him find peace. And maybe, just maybe, he could do that. The rest of the day went by in a blur. Jason tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept drifting back to his conversation with Mark, and more importantly, the things he had been learning in therapy. He was beginning to see how deep the effects of everything had been on him, how his anger and fear had shaped his actions and his relationships. The realization was jarring, but in a strange way, it was also liberating. The truth was painful, but it was also the first step in taking control of his own life again. After school, Jason had one of his daily check-ins with Dr. Matthews. They had only met a few times, but Jason was already starting to feel like he could trust her. She had a way of making him feel heard without judgment, and today, she had an exercise for him, an exercise that involved writing down what he was struggling with, what he needed to forgive, and who he needed to forgive. At first, Jason hesitated. The idea of putting his feelings into words on paper felt incredibly vulnerable. But something about Dr. Matthews' calm presence made him feel like this was something he needed to do. He began to write, slowly at first, unsure of what to say. But then the words started to come. He wrote about the pain he felt from the betrayal, from the judgment of others. He wrote about his anger, his fear, and his guilt. And as he wrote, he felt a strange sense of relief, like he was finally giving himself permission to let go. "I'm angry at myself," he admitted during their session. "I feel like I failed. Like I could have done something to stop it, but I didn't. And now, it feels like I'll never be able to make things right." Dr. Matthews nodded thoughtfully. "Jason, you're being hard on yourself. The truth is, none of us can control what happens around us. But what we can control is how we respond, how we move forward. It's not about making things perfect. It's about learning from what happened and finding the strength to keep going." Jason paused, letting her words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't need to fix everything all at once. Maybe all he needed was to allow himself to heal, step by step. And that was enough for now. Jason walked out of Dr. Matthews' office that afternoon with a weight lifted off his shoulders. He had been hesitant to engage with the process of forgiveness, both of himself and of others, but today felt different. Today, something inside him clicked. He had shared his feelings, written down his pain, and allowed himself to finally start the journey toward healing. But it wasn't over. It never was, he realized. Life wasn't about a single breakthrough moment, it was about the little moments in between. The small victories that compounded over time. As he walked to his car, Jason thought back to the last few months. The initial shock of everything had hit him like a freight train. The anger. The confusion. The betrayal. It had been impossible to process all at once. But now, after weeks of reflection, therapy, and the support of those around him, he was beginning to understand something important. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending things hadn't happened. It meant accepting what had been and taking control of how he moved forward from it. Jason knew that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of resentment toward others, it was also about forgiving himself. He had been carrying around a burden of guilt for far too long, and it was time to release it. The more he sat with the idea, the more he felt a sense of calm. It was time to forgive himself for not being perfect, for not always knowing the right thing to do, for holding on to things that weren't his fault. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Mark. "Hey, man, you free tonight? Thought we could grab dinner." Jason smiled at the message. It had been a while since he had done anything outside of school or therapy, and the idea of catching up with his best friend seemed like the perfect distraction. He quickly typed a reply, "Yeah, I'm down. Where should we go?" Mark's response was immediate. "How about that burger place you like? We can talk about your therapy stuff, or not. Your choice." Jason didn't even have to think about it. "Sounds good. I'll meet you there at 7. When Jason arrived at the burger place that evening, he found Mark already seated at a corner booth, scrolling through his phone. As soon as he saw Jason, Mark looked up with a grin and waved him over. "Hey, dude. How's it going?" Mark asked as Jason slid into the booth across from him. "Good, actually. I've been thinking about some stuff. Therapy, you know," Jason said, taking a sip of water from the glass in front of him. "It's different than I thought it would be." Mark raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" And that was enough for now. Jason walked out of Dr. Matthews' office that afternoon with a weight lifted off his shoulders. He had been hesitant to engage with the process of forgiveness, both of himself and of others, but today felt different. Today, something inside him clicked. He had shared his feelings, written down his pain, and allowed himself to finally start the journey toward healing. But it wasn't over. It never was, he realized. Life wasn't about a single breakthrough moment, it was about the little moments in between. The small victories that compounded over time. As he walked to his car, Jason thought back to the last few months. The initial shock of everything had hit him like a freight train. The anger. The confusion. The betrayal. It had been impossible to process all at once. But now, after weeks of reflection, therapy, and the support of those around him, he was beginning to understand something important. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending things hadn't happened. It meant accepting what had been and taking control of how he moved forward from it. Jason knew that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of resentment toward others, it was also about forgiving himself. He had been carrying around a burden of guilt for far too long, and it was time to release it. The more he sat with the idea, the more he felt a sense of calm. It was time to forgive himself for not being perfect, for not always knowing the right thing to do, for holding on to things that weren't his fault. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Mark. "Hey, man, you free tonight? Thought we could grab dinner." Jason smiled at the message. It had been a while since he had done anything outside of school or therapy, and the idea of catching up with his best friend seemed like the perfect distraction. He quickly typed a reply, "Yeah, I'm down. Where should we go?" Mark's response was immediate. "How about that burger place you like? We can talk about your therapy stuff, or not. Your choice." Jason didn't even have to think about it. "Sounds good. I'll meet you there at 7. When Jason arrived at the burger place that evening, he found Mark already seated at a corner booth, scrolling through his phone. As soon as he saw Jason, Mark looked up with a grin and waved him over. "Hey, dude. How's it going?" Mark asked as Jason slid into the booth across from him. "Good, actually. I've been thinking about some stuff. Therapy, you know," Jason said, taking a sip of water from the glass in front of him. "It's different than I thought it would be." Mark raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" Jason leaned back in the booth, thinking carefully. "Well, it's hard to explain, but I think it's helping. Not just with the whole Ms. Lawrence situation, but with me. With how I see myself, I guess. I've been carrying a lot of guilt around, and it's just heavy, you know." Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. You've been through a lot, man. But you can't keep beating yourself up over stuff you couldn't control." Jason smiled a little at the way Mark phrased it. His friend always had a way of simplifying things when they felt too complicated. "I know," Jason replied. "But it's hard. I keep thinking that if I'd done things differently, maybe things wouldn't have turned out this way." "Dude, no one has a crystal ball. You can't go back and change things. What you can do is focus on what's in front of you now." Jason was quiet for a moment, letting Mark's words sink in. He couldn't change the past. He could only learn from it and move forward. That realization wasn't as painful as he had expected it to be. Instead, it was freeing. Before Jason could respond, the waitress came over to take their order. They quickly placed their food requests, and then Jason leaned forward, deciding to open up a bit more to Mark. "You know," Jason began, his voice quieter, "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness, too. Not just forgiving other people, but forgiving myself. For the stuff I can't fix, for the stuff I let happen." Mark looked at him thoughtfully. "That's big. But it's also something you've got to do for yourself, not for anyone else. You can't carry that weight forever." Jason felt a sense of relief as he spoke. The more he let these thoughts out, the less they seemed to control him. His relationship with forgiveness was no longer just an idea to wrestle with, it was becoming something real, something that could help him heal. The conversation turned lighter after that, and Jason found himself laughing at something Mark said, the easy comfort of their friendship filling the space between them. They ate, joked around, and talked about everything except the heavy stuff for a while. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was allowed to simply be. Not the victim. Not the guy who had lost so much. Just Jason. When dinner was over, they stepped outside into the cool evening air. Jason paused for a moment before turning to Mark. "Thanks for always being there for me, man," Jason said, his voice sincere. Mark shrugged it off, but his eyes were warm. "That's what friends are for." They stood there for a few more moments, just breathing in the night air, comfortable in the silence. As Jason got in his car to head home, he reflected on the evening. The conversation with Mark had been exactly what he needed, a reminder that he wasn't alone. He had people in his life who cared about him, who didn't expect him to have it all together. They weren't judging him. They were just there, rooting for him as he figured things out. That night, as Jason lay in bed, he thought about what it meant to forgive, to truly forgive himself and others. It was a process. It wasn't something that could be done in one night, in one conversation. But it was a start. And it was the beginning of something new. Tomorrow was a new day. And Jason was finally starting to feel like he was ready to take it on. The weeks that followed felt like a strange mix of gradual change and sudden clarity. Jason had been through a lot. His world had been turned upside down by events that felt beyond his control, but now, looking back, he realized he had been the one holding the power all along, not to change the past, but to shape his future. Therapy continued to be a cornerstone of his healing. Dr. Matthews had become more than just a therapist, she was a guide, helping him navigate his complicated emotions and the new, unfamiliar parts of himself he was only just beginning to understand. Every session, Jason felt as though he was uncovering a little more of who he really was and what he wanted his life to look like. One day, after a particularly powerful session, Dr. Matthews asked him a question that stuck with him long after he left her office. "What do you want out of this journey, Jason?" she had asked, her eyes kind but probing. He'd been silent for a while, thinking carefully. He wasn't used to thinking about the future. His life had been consumed by anger and pain for so long that the idea of focusing on something positive seemed almost foreign. "I guess," Jason had started, unsure of himself. "I want peace. I want to not feel like I'm always carrying this weight around. I want to feel like I can breathe again." Dr. Matthews had smiled softly. "That's a good start. And peace doesn't mean everything is perfect. It just means you found a way to live with the imperfections." Jason had walked out of the office feeling lighter somehow. The weight of everything was still there, but it no longer felt like it would crush him. He was beginning to realize that peace wasn't an absence of struggle, it was a way of learning to navigate the struggles without letting them define him. As he walked to his car, Jason thought about the things he'd learned in therapy, about the work he still had to do, and about the one person who had started it all, Ms. Lawrence. He hadn't spoken to her since the incident. The idea of confronting her still felt like a monumental task, but as the days passed, Jason found himself wondering if he would ever be able to truly move on without addressing what had happened between them. He couldn't keep avoiding it. For his own peace of mind, he needed to face it. Not necessarily for closure, but to take back control of the narrative. But that wasn't something Jason was ready for just yet. It would take time, and that was okay. For now, he was focusing on his own healing, his own growth. The next few days were a blur of school, therapy, and moments of quiet reflection. Jason had made it through the worst of it. His grades were improving, he was starting to feel like himself again, and he had begun spending more time with Mark and his family, people who made him feel grounded and loved. One Friday afternoon, as he was walking out of school with Mark, something unexpected happened. As they crossed the parking lot, Jason spotted someone he hadn't seen in weeks, his dad's old colleague, Mrs. Carter. She had been a close family friend for years, and Jason had always gotten along with her. But after the incident with Ms. Lawrence, he hadn't seen much of her. "Hey, Jason. How've you been?" she called out with a warm smile, walking toward him. Jason smiled back, surprised but happy to see her. "Hi, Mrs. Carter. I'm doing better, actually. You?" "I'm doing well, thanks. I heard about everything that happened, and I just wanted to check in with you. I know it's been tough." Jason nodded, feeling a little awkward. "Yeah, it's been a lot. But I'm getting through it." Mrs. Carter's expression softened. "I know you are. And I'm really proud of you. You're one of the strongest young people I know, Jason." Her words felt like a balm on a wound he hadn't even realized was still tender. He didn't often hear words of praise, and the sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. It reminded him that, even in the midst of all the chaos, there were still people who believed in him. "Thanks, Mrs. Carter," Jason said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." She smiled again, her eyes kind and understanding. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me, okay? Don't hesitate." Jason nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. "I will. Thanks." As she walked away, Jason turned to Mark, who had been standing quietly by his side. "I forgot how much I missed people like Mrs. Carter," Jason admitted, his voice tinged with a mixture of surprise and relief. Mark gave him a knowing look. "Yeah, man. People who don't judge you. Who see you for who you really are." Jason thought about that for a moment, realizing how much he'd needed that reminder. In the past, he'd been so focused on the judgment of others that he had missed the people who truly cared about him, who saw beyond his mistakes and his struggles. That evening, as he sat down for dinner with his dad, Jason couldn't help but reflect on everything that had changed. His dad had been supportive, though distant at times, but now Jason felt like there was a greater connection between them. It wasn't just about the aftermath of everything that had happened, it was about moving forward together. "Hey, Dad," Jason said, as they ate in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking. I want to talk to Ms. Lawrence." His dad looked up from his plate, surprised. "About what?" "I'm not sure yet," Jason replied. "But I feel like if I'm going to really heal, I need to talk to her. It doesn't have to be anything big. I just need to do it." His dad nodded slowly. "I understand. But remember, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Jason smiled faintly, a new resolve in his eyes. "I'm ready." Later that night, as Jason lay in bed, he felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. This was the next step in his journey, the next challenge he would face. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control. Whatever happened next, he would be okay. The road ahead was still long, but Jason knew that the ripples of his choices were beginning to shape the life he wanted. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace within himself. Jason's heart raced as he sat in the car outside Ms. Lawrence's house. The rain had started to fall lightly, tapping against the windshield in a rhythmic pattern. It was a cold, dreary afternoon, and the gray skies matched the uncertainty swirling in his mind. He had been debating this moment for weeks, deciding whether or not to reach out to Ms. Lawrence. And now, here he was, on her doorstep, trying to summon the courage to confront the past. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. It was a text from Mark. "You sure about this, man? You don't have to do it if you're not ready." Jason stared at the message for a moment. It was thoughtful, but he had made up his mind. He wasn't just doing this for closure, he was doing it for himself. He had spent so long hiding from the difficult conversations, pretending that if he avoided them, the pain would go away. But he knew now that avoiding it only made it worse. To move forward, he had to face it head-on. "I have to," he replied to Mark. "It's the only way I'll be able to move on." After a deep breath, Jason pushed the door open and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit him immediately, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the conversation he was about to have. Would it go the way he hoped? Would Ms. Lawrence be receptive? Or would it only make things more complicated? He rang the doorbell, his heart thumping in his chest. Moments later, the door opened, and there she was, Ms. Lawrence. She looked just as he remembered her, though there was a certain tiredness in her eyes that made her seem older. The years had passed, but the events that connected them still lingered between them, unsaid, unaddressed. "Jason," she said softly, surprised but not unkind. "I didn't expect to see you here. Can we talk?" Jason asked, his voice firmer than he felt inside. He didn't want to waste time with small talk. He needed to say what he had come to say. Ms. Lawrence hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. "Come in. We can talk." They sat down in the living room, the same room where, months ago, everything had come crashing down. Jason felt the weight of the history in the room, every word, every glance, every emotion they had never fully expressed. But he was ready now. He wasn't a teenager trapped in confusion and pain anymore. He was a young man, determined to reclaim control of his life. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Jason began, his eyes fixed on the floor as he spoke. "And I realized that I've never really asked you what happened. I just assumed things. I was angry, and I didn't know how to deal with it." Ms. Lawrence remained silent, watching him carefully. She seemed uncertain, but Jason could see the vulnerability in her eyes. She had never intended for things to turn out this way, but she knew she had made mistakes too. After all, she had been the one to take something that should have been sacred, the trust of a student, and turn it into something that would haunt them both. "I want to understand," Jason continued, his voice shaking slightly. "What happened? What was going through your mind at the time?" Ms. Lawrence let out a long sigh, her hands clasped together in her lap. "I don't think I ever fully understood what was going through my own mind," she said, her voice quiet. "I made a choice that I deeply regret, Jason. I crossed a line I shouldn't have. I can't explain why I did it, and I can't take back what happened. All I can do is acknowledge it and tell you that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the hurt I caused you." Jason listened intently, the words landing on him in waves. He had always wondered if she even felt remorse for what she had done, but now, hearing her say those words, hearing her own admission of guilt, he realized something important: healing didn't always mean receiving the answers you wanted. Sometimes, it meant accepting what you got and moving forward with it. "I've been angry for a long time," Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I guess part of me thought that if I stayed angry, it would give me control over what happened. But it didn't. It just kept me stuck." Ms. Lawrence nodded slowly, her eyes soft. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Jason. I just want you to know that I truly regret my actions. I never meant for any of this to happen." Jason took a deep breath, the tension in his chest easing a little. "I'm not sure I can forgive you right now," he admitted. "But I think I'm ready to move on. I can't hold on to this anger forever." Ms. Lawrence reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly. "That means more to me than you'll ever know," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Jason didn't take her hand. Instead, he stood up, his mind made up. "I'm going to work on forgiving myself too," he said, looking her in the eye. "And I think that's the first step." Ms. Lawrence nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I truly wish you the best, Jason. I hope you find the peace you deserve." Jason turned to leave, but before he did, he stopped at the door. He glanced back at her, his heart a little lighter than it had been when he entered. "I'm going to be okay," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of finality. "And I'm going to move forward." With that, he stepped out into the rain again. This time, the rain didn't feel so heavy. It felt cleansing, almost like a rebirth. He had done it. He had faced the past, and now, he was free to begin the next chapter of his life. As he drove home, Jason reflected on what had just transpired. He had walked into that house feeling like a man torn between his past and his future, but he walked out feeling like a man who had finally taken control of his story. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. But it was a start. And that was enough. The road to healing wasn't a straight line, but Jason was learning to embrace the journey. There would be ups and downs, moments of doubt and moments of clarity. But as long as he kept moving forward, as long as he kept learning and growing, he knew he would be okay. Tomorrow was a new day. And he was ready for it. The next few weeks were a blur of small victories and moments of quiet reflection. Jason had done something he never thought possible: he'd forgiven himself. It wasn't an overnight change, nor was it the result of a single conversation. It had been a slow, methodical process, a layering of understanding, healing, and most importantly, self-compassion. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was standing on solid ground. Life after the conversation with Ms. Lawrence was strange at first. It wasn't like everything magically fell into place. There were still days when Jason felt the weight of his past, still moments where the anger would creep in and threaten to overwhelm him. But now, instead of running from those feelings, he allowed himself to sit with them, process them, and then let them go. The lessons he had learned in therapy, his conversations with Mark and his dad, and, of course, the confrontation with Ms. Lawrence, it all led him to this moment. He was no longer defined by what had happened to him. He was defined by how he chose to move forward. It wasn't just his emotional health that had shifted. Jason had been working hard to rebuild his relationships, especially with his dad. The two of them had started talking more, really talking, beyond just the surface stuff. There were still awkward moments, but those were becoming fewer. His dad had apologized in his own way, silent support, a little more patience, and sometimes, just being present when Jason needed him. It wasn't a perfect father-son relationship, but it was real, and that was enough. The most surprising change, however, came when Jason walked back into the classroom. After everything had settled, he had returned to school. It was almost like a fresh start. He'd been dreading the idea of seeing his classmates, knowing that the rumors and whispers about what had happened with Ms. Lawrence had probably spread. But as he stepped into the school hallway that first day, he realized something that both shocked and relieved him: no one cared. No one was looking at him with pity or judgment. Everyone was just going about their day, lost in their own worlds. It was as though the events of the past were nothing more than distant memories to everyone else, and Jason could breathe again. He was still Jason, quiet, reserved, and trying to figure out where he belonged in the world, but he was also someone different. Stronger. More self-aware. More compassionate. A few days after returning to school, Jason found himself walking into his favorite corner of the library, the place he used to retreat to when everything felt too heavy. But now, it felt like a sanctuary, a place to dream and create and think without the weight of past mistakes hanging over him. Mark found him there later that afternoon, like he always did. "Hey man, I thought I'd find you here," Mark said, taking a seat beside him. "What's going on?" Jason looked up from the book he had been reading, a small smile forming on his face. "Just catching up on some reading. I've been trying to get back into the things I used to love." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's cool. You ever think about what's next for you? After everything?" Jason paused, thinking for a moment. The future had always been an intimidating idea for him. It was always something uncertain, filled with endless possibilities but also full of fear. But now, as he sat there in the quiet of the library, Jason realized that he wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready to embrace whatever came next. "I've been thinking about it," he said slowly. "I want to finish school. Maybe I'll even go to college. But I think I want to help other people who are going through things like I did. I want to be someone who can show them that it's okay to not have everything figured out. And that it's okay to make mistakes and learn from them." Mark looked at him with an expression of admiration. "Man, that's awesome. You've been through a lot, but look at you now." Jason chuckled softly. "Yeah. Who would have thought?" It wasn't just about forgiving others anymore. It was about forgiving himself and understanding that he had the power to create the future he wanted. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be moments of doubt, but Jason knew that whatever came next, he had the strength to face it. As Jason stood up and left the library that afternoon, the air felt different. It was like the world had opened up to him, and he was finally seeing it for the first time. He wasn't just walking through life anymore, he was living it. Every step forward felt like a victory, a testament to how far he had come. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?